yields back. Yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Westmoreland.
Thank you, Chairman. We passed a good cyber bill, I think, out of the House that allowed businesses to share information without the liability question. And as Adam mentioned, that we hear about attacks and then we hear about intrusions. When does playing defense become offense? In other words, if some of these companies have picked out a marker, we have determined where it is coming from. Do we continually play defense with that or try to come up with a better defense? Or is some action that we might take going to be considered offensive to whether it's a nation state or another company or whatever? Where is that line at?
So for us, particularly on the DoD side, I'm pretty comfortable that we've got a fairly well understood characterization of what is defensive in nature in terms of actions and response. The bigger challenge in some ways is there is still uncertainty about how would you characterize what is offensive and what is authorized. Again, that boils down ultimately to a policy decision. And to date, we have tended to do that on a case-by-case basis. In terms of your fundamental premise, I think importantly, and a comment that I certainly make when I'm part of the discussions, a purely reactive defensive strategy is not ultimately, I think, going to change the dynamic where we are now. And the dynamic we find ourselves in now, I don't think is acceptable to anyone.
Well, when you say it's a policy issue, are we talking about a policy issue that comes out of the White House?
So the application of cyber in an offensive way is an application of force. The application of force under the law of armed conflict in the broader policy construct that we use as nations, once you move beyond self-defense, is a decision that is made at a broad policy level. It's not something I, for example, as the director of NSA or as the commander of U.S. Cyber Command, just unilaterally decide. It's not the framework. Again, not unique to the cyber world. It's the same fundamental construct we use for the application of force in the kinetic world within the Department of Defense and more broadly in other areas.
So how is that sifted out? I mean, who makes that determination?
So it depends on a case-by-case basis, but clearly the Secretary of Defense has granted some authorities. The President retains some authorities at his level. The process that we work through, and we deal with each individual event on the merits of its own.
Well, you understand that when the public hears the word attack, it gives off a little different meaning than if we say intrusion.
Right. Which is one reason I think you also raise an important point. Terminology and lexicon is very important in this space. And many times I'll hear people throw out attack, act of war, and I go, that's not necessarily in every case how I would characterize the activity that I see.
So that is a good distinction to make, and just using the OPM breach as a case in point, that really, although it's been characterized by some loosely as an attack, it really wasn't, since it was entirely passive, and it didn't result in destruction or any of those kinds of effects. So that the distinction you point out, and thank you for doing that, is quite important. And as Admiral Rogers says, the lexicon, the terminology is crucial.
If a company or they discover that they're being attacked by a certain entity or whatever, and they use a means to stop that attack. In other words, they can figure out how to stop that attack. Can they do that offensively, I guess? And what would differentiate between an offensive move and a defensive move?
Yeah. First of all, there's a clear line in the United States, right? It would be a crime for any private actor to engage in an offensive cyber operation, to penetrate without permission the computer system of another. That's a statute that this Congress has passed I think so. That's a clear line. I think it also makes good sense to those of us in the intelligence community that we don't self-help, because of the nature of the cyberspace is that there are unforeseen consequences that are could be dramatic and unforeseen.
I think, getting back to the definition, I think that's what we're looking for, is a definition of what is offensive and what's defensive. But thank you very much, and I yield back.
Gentlemen,